All right, so my job today is to provide a zoomed out view of grazing in the National Wilderness Preservation System. And I'm going to be working a couple pieces of technology here, so there we go. So to get a grasp of the lands at issue, here's a nationwide view of what we're looking at. Only about 3% of all of the land in the lower 48 states is protected as designated wilderness. Try not to move my head too much either. And grazing in wilderness takes place almost exclusively west of the Mississippi. So we're focusing primarily on western states and primarily on Forest Service and BLM administered wilderness areas. And so these areas are a little bit hard to see on this map, but they're represented by the green and yellow designations. And here is a slightly better view. So this is roughly 50 million acres of wilderness, and of those, about 13 million acres are allotted for livestock grazing. And just to put these numbers in perspective for everybody, in agency speak, cows and sheep graze approximately 530,000 animal unit months, or AUMs, in wilderness, out of a total of 15.6 million AUMs nationwide. And I don't know if everybody is familiar with what an AUM is, but that's basically the amount of forage that is needed for one mature cow and her calf, or 5 sheep for a month. So wilderness AUMs account for only about 3% of the total, which means that wilderness represents a very, very tiny amount of all the forage fed to cows and sheep in the United States. But the amount of harm that grazing does to wilderness and the wild animals who are finding increasingly scarce refuge there is significant. And to provide another visual of what this looks like on the ground, this chart breaks down the acreages by state. As you can see, the states with the most grazing in wilderness include Nevada, Arizona, California, and Colorado. And Utah holds the high distinction of having an individual wilderness with the most acreage grazed within its boundaries. And Gary will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And you'll notice on the chart that there's a distinction between allotted acres and grazed acres. So the allotted acres total about 13 million, and the grazed acres total about 10 million. And this is because each allotment may not be grazed every year for various reasons, like voluntary non-use or drought, hypothetically, or in theory, or vacancy. And vacant allotments are really important in wilderness. They represent the bulk of the 3 million acres that are not actively grazed. And these areas don't have a permittee on the allotment, so there's no permitted issue. But there's nothing stopping the agencies from reissuing those permits in the future, so they're at risk of being grazed again. And a lot of these allotments have been vacant for decades, and so they have significantly recovered from the impacts of past livestock grazing. And as we know, a lot of these areas provide essential core habitat for a lot of species that really don't mix well with cows and sheep. And so these vacant allotments in wilderness are really kind of the low-hanging fruit for permanent closure. And I'll give you an example here of why permanent closure is so important. So this is an example of vacant allotments that the Forest Service is trying to reopen to grazing right now. The map on the left there shows the Elk Ridge allotments in and around the Grovant Wilderness, and this is in the Upper Green River Valley of Wyoming. They were grazed by domestic sheep until 2016, when the permit holders received a very substantial amount of money to retire these sheep allotment permits. And the assumption at the time was that these areas would not be grazed again. They would be permanently closed to livestock grazing. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the Upper Green, but it's this really spectacular wild landscape. It's part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's a major wildlife migration area. Lots of grizzly bears live in the area. And unfortunately, this area is also notorious for cow and sheep conflicts with grizzly bears and other wildlife. I think I was thinking looking at this map thinking that grizzly bears probably look at livestock grazing as the DoorDash of the wild world. I don't know who would pass up having some mutton delivered to their doorstep, but if you look at the map on the right here, each of those circles represents a conflict between cows and sheep and grizzlies, and that's since 2010. And these are in allotments that are adjacent to the vacant allotments there on the left. And so, unfortunately, the agencies have killed dozens of grizzly bears in this area. And as we know, grizzly bears are supposed to be protected under the Endangered Species Act, but this cycle continues in this area. And so, part of the reason for the buyout back in 2016 was to reduce conflicts with grizzlies. So now, here we are 6 years later, the Forest Service is proposing to reopen these vacant allotments now to cows, rationalizing that the buyout in 2016 only pertained to sheep. So getting permanent closures is really important for these areas. So I'm going to step back just a little bit because I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that there is grazing occurring at all in wilderness. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. The Wilderness Act of all of our federal environmental statutes is the most protective. It was passed in 1964 in response to, I believe, what our keynote speaker called the big acceleration. It was passed to ensure that an increasing population, back in the 50s and the 60s with all of its technological advances and growing mechanization, didn't modify every inch of land on this planet, leaving no areas for protection in their natural condition. So this was an attempt in the 1960s at some restraint. And listening to the talks yesterday, and I was going through my own presentation this morning, and it struck me how rigged the game is from the get-go. Hearing the language that we are forced to use, talking about animal unit months, talking about non-essential experimental populations, talking about stocking levels, it's no wonder that we can't gain any ground. And so I think part of the reason for that is our land management statutes are born out of this mindset, and they're born out of this language. Most have multiple use mandates, where the administering agency has to juggle various competing uses of the land. A lot of these are very consumptive and extractive and commercial uses. And somebody mentioned the rights of nature yesterday, and I very much believe that that's a direction that we need to head. Right now, the closest thing that we have for a federal statute in that regard is the Wilderness Act. Unlike the other multiple use statutes that are out there right now, the Wilderness Act's purpose is the preservation of wilderness character. And so the Wilderness Act defines wilderness as an area where man and his own works dominate, or in contrast to areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape. And instead, wilderness is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, and where natural processes dictate conditions on the ground. And so these are areas where they were statutorily removed from the usual agency discretion and numbers game that we deal with in other places. And so to preserve wilderness character, the Act prohibits various things. It prohibits commercial enterprise, it prohibits roads, motor vehicles, equipment, aircraft, and structures. And if we don't have the tools of industrialization at our disposal, it's a lot harder to muck things up, or at least we do it at a much slower pace than we would otherwise. The first draft of the Wilderness Act back in '56 also prohibited grazing. So grazing is a commercial enterprise. It's often associated with things like roads and development and predator killing. And as we would increasingly see over the years, it's also associated with a lot of motorized use, people driving trucks and ATVs into the area, and using heavy equipment to maintain all of the development that usually comes along with cows being on the land. So very much not in line with the goals of the Wilderness Act. But nonetheless, as we know, the livestock industry and the livestock story in the United States has a lot of political sway. And so the provision prohibiting grazing was cut from the final version of the act. And this is what we got. This is a special provision that said the grazing of livestock shall be permitted to continue subject to reasonable regulations deemed necessary by the Secretary. So that's it. It didn't explain how this provision interacts with the prohibitions on roads and motorized use and structures and development. The Secretary never created reasonable regulations for grazing and wilderness, and so anybody who has been involved in this area for any length of time can guess that this resulted in a lot of very confused agency decision-making. Back when the Wilderness Act was passed, there wasn't a lot of grazing going on in wilderness, and there was very little motorized use that was associated with it. So the problems with this didn't become apparent until a little bit down the road when things started becoming more motorized. And when that happened, the livestock interests were up in arms, so to speak, about new wilderness designations. They argued that new wilderness would preclude all of the things that make grazing a lot easier, the motorized use and the developments, and would impede grazing as a result. And so fast forward to 1980, and I apologize, these slides are a little text heavy, but this is really important. Congress issued what is known as the Congressional Grazing Guidelines, and they, in my opinion, represent the biggest hurdle that we have to reining in some of the more egregious grazing-related practices in wilderness. So to take just a really brief look at this, the guidelines lay out 5 clarifications regarding grazing in wilderness. And the first is that there can't be any curtailments of grazing in wilderness simply because an area has been designated as wilderness. And so to reduce livestock grazing or to end it on certain allotments, it has to be for a reason that you could do that outside of wilderness. And so that includes things like conflicts with wildlife, not meeting standards, those sorts of things. The guidelines also said that the livestock that was existing at the time of designation should be sort of the number that it stays at. So it shouldn't be expanded after wilderness designation. The guidelines allowed the maintenance of already existing support facilities in wilderness. It allowed motorized use, but only where practical alternatives don't exist and only where motorized use existed at the time that the area was designated wilderness. And it's got some other things in there. New improvements should be used for resource protection rather than to accommodate more livestock. And motorized use for emergencies is allowed, but it has to be a true emergency. And it's something that was not supposed to be abused by the ranchers. Not surprisingly, again, what we've seen is an increasingly loose interpretation of the guidelines by the agencies. Probably the most problematic thing is they view this no curtailments grazing of grazing language to mean that livestock grazing has more permanence in wilderness than it does outside of wilderness, which is not accurate. And we've also seen motorized use and development authorizations really going off the rails. Oh, I didn't know that feature was in there. It's fancy. So here's an example. In the Owyhee region, the BLM authorized a permittee to drive his ATV around the Little Jacks Creek Wilderness, and I love this. The ATV use is restricted to herding livestock between pastures and routinely checking livestock, which doesn't sound like very much of a restriction on motorized use. We've got another example out of the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness in Colorado, where BLM let another rancher drive around in wilderness to check on livestock in order to detect emergencies and haul camp supplies. At the time this particular wilderness was designated, the number of AUMs on these allotments in wilderness was 0. And after wilderness designation, BLM authorized 880 AUMs in one and 328 in the other. So pretty substantial deviations from the grazing guidelines. And then as an example of just how much development is usually associated with livestock grazing in wilderness, this decision came out of the Gila bioregion. Pretty substantial development. A lot of it occurred in the Blue Range Primitive area, which is generally managed as wilderness. And so those are just a few examples to highlight what is happening on the ground in wilderness. And I'm not going to dive too much into these. We've got a white paper available on our website and some other materials if you want to take a look at some of the solutions that we're proposing. Obviously, voluntary grazing permit retirement is a big one, and we're really pushing to make sure that that is associated with permanent allotment closures when it does happen. And then maybe taking a look at revising the congressional grazing guidelines. And with that, I will pass the mic.
Okay, can someone do the magic? It looks like Brett is.